thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to this workshop. As you have said, I am going to present this, that is a classification scheme for CAP interventions based on farming practices that has been developed at the Joint Research Center. The Joint Research Center is the science and knowledge service that supports the European Commission whenever we can, where I work now. So next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So I wanted first to introduce a little bit some notes on the CAP strategic plan that you may know, but it's to illustrate this apparent diversity that is behind this policy. So each member state, that designs a different strategic plan, all within a common legislative framework, but every country has the flexibility to define interventions that align better with their national needs. So in a strategic plan, an intervention is this supportive tool with some eligibility criteria that has been defined by the member states. And into each of these interventions, there is a budget allocated. Next slide, please. So another key element on the CAP plans is the unit amount. The unit amount is the funding that is planned per output unit. An output unit can be an hectare, can be an animal, can be a project. So each intervention has to include at least one unit amount, but you can have various unit amounts per intervention. These multiple unit amount allow for a precise targeting within the same intervention. So these unit amounts can be like basic units of analysis for CAP implementation and performance. Next slide, please. So we have member states that have defined interventions that they are best suited for their unique circumstances. So that leads to a wide range of tailored interventions throughout Europe. And in this variety, we see sometimes a convergence in actions when they are designed to achieve the same objective. So even in these cases where actions converge, different terminologies can make a big difference between interventions that they are actually prescribing the same actions. So we have different sources of variability. On the one hand, we have the national realities, and on the other hand, we have the own different definition of the actions. Next slide, please. So to have an idea of what we have across all member states, we have, for example, 158 eco schemes that range from numerous specific eco schemes on sub-CAP plans to one single eco scheme with various options, for example, for different ambition levels, and the unit amounts associated at more than 500 that can vary based on different factors like land use or region or environmental condition. Next slide. So if we look at the agro-environment and climate commitments, the number is increased. So we have 377 interventions, and we have close to 5,000 unit amounts that in some member states, like for example, Italy, that has more than 1,600 unit amounts in agro-environmental and climate measures, they have impressive numbers. So next slide, please. To facilitate the comprehension of these heterogeneous CAP plans, we need a systematic approach based on some basic homogenizing units. This is particularly interesting for the green architecture, for the climate and environment interventions. So a structured framework at the European level could definitively simplify this complexity and facilitate the understanding. And this simplification could be achieved by focusing on the actual farming practices that the interventions support. That could be basic unit of management. So the JRC has developed a classification scheme based on the analysis of the CAP strategic plans, focusing on the farming practices that are described in the program measures, to define a comprehensive set of labels for this environmental and climate intervention. This schemes serves to report and aggregate similar interventions, so you can compare across different member states and different CAP areas, as you see here in the slide, it has a tiered structure in levels to accommodate to the different level of details that you can find in the description of the farming practices. Next slide, please. So it's based on existing partial thematic classification and in a first scan of the draft strategic plans that were submitted to the Commission in 2021. And then it has been developed through an iterative process with several development cycles. Next slide, please. In each cycle, we had feedback for various stakeholders that has been applied to different versions that include members of the European Commission, of the CAP Evaluation Help Desk, researchers, and member states. Next slide, please. So the final classification was achieved after a first labeling exercise that consists on the matching of the different categories with the description of the environmental and climate intervention by GAP strategic plan. So this exercise of labeling all strategic plan was fundamental to understand the limitation and needs and to get the final classification. Next slide. So the classification, the farming practices are aggregated in 18 sections that they are not classifiers as such. They are just to help the user to navigate in the big scheme. And the actual scheme is composed by 45 Tier 1 categories, 174 Tier 2, and 157 Tier 3. So as you can see in the example that you see in your slide, soil management would be the section, is not the classifier. And then at Tier 1, that is the first level, the soil management section will have farm practices on soil cover, on tillage, on machinery use. And at Tier 2, the next level, tillage would have farm practices as low tillage, no tillage or tillage restrictions that can be tillage on timing or on slopes. And those further details would go at Tier 3 level. We have as well this that you see on the left part of the slide that are additional labels that are used to define, for instance, this land use category or animal types. Next slide, please. So this graph represents the size of the section according to the number of categories that are contained. So each different color is one section, and that will be bigger the more categories the section has. Next slide, please. The bigger one is this blue one, the landscape. Is the biggest one because it has, for instance, categories for each type of landscape feature that can be prescribed in a CAP plan with differentiation between maintenance and new implementation of landscape features. Agroforestry is here included, traditional landscape, and so on. Next slide, please. Other important sections are, for example, the one dealing with animal-related intervention that has practices related to animal welfare or beekeeping, for example, or the section about fertilization and soil amendments that contain practices related to specific fertilizers, to limitations to the use of fertilizers, and so on. All that you see here are Tier 1 levels, so the lowest level of detail, then the classification can go deeper in the detail. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So the final objective of the classification is this, that is the labeling of interventions by farming practices that I mentioned before. Each intervention is labeled so that all prescribed farming practices are matched with a category in the scheme. So this way, the interventions are somehow translated to a common languages that it allows for aggregation and comparison. Next slide. So once intervention are labeled, then the policy implementation can be analyzed. A preliminary analysis following the labeling was done at Tier 1 level in this study that you see here that was performed by the evaluation health test that you may know. Next slide, please. Where we can, for example, understand the nature of the most common program farming practice on the eco schemes across all member states. Remember that we had 158 eco schemes with more than 500 unit amounts, but you see that the main interventions addressed limitations on the use of plant protection products at your right of the screen, and the use of fertilizer on the left side of the screen. Next slide, please. So A detailed and consolidated labeling by unit amount done by the CAP Evaluation Help Desk and the JRC will be made available through the DG Agri catalog of CAT interventions that I don't know if you know, but you have here the link if you want to consult it, and will be a very interesting policy analysis tool. Next slide, please. But further, once that we have labeled the interventions by farming practices, they can be linked to the actual expected environmental impacts that they have. Next slide, please. So this work of building the classification is part of a wider effort that the JRC is doing to develop tools for implementation and evaluation of the CAP for DG Agri in the framework of a project called IMAP. The IMAP project has done a systematic compilation of scientific knowledge that maybe you can be interested in, and has created a database of environmental impacts of farming practices that allows for this thematic analysis of specific impacts. If you're interested, you have the links to the content in this slide and the next slide. Next slide, please. So with this final link to the impacts of farming practices, the analysis can be further extended to understand the expected environmental outcomes of the strategic plans and their implementation, and the results of the labeling exercise, for example, will be feeding this CAPRI model that I don't know if you know it, provide results at regional level on the impacts of agricultural policies on economic and environmental variables. Next slide, please. And here you can find the detailed description of the methodology followed and all the classification scheme with all the definition of the classes. And yeah, thank you for your attention.